The funeral games have ended, and Achilles, who still mourns for Patroclus, drags Hector's body behind his chariot around Patroclus's tomb. 12 days after the death of Hector, Apollo pleads with the gods to save the body of the Trojan prince. In response, Zeus declares that Achilles must receive a ransom from King Priam. Achilles must give Hector's body back. Zeus tells Thetis his plan, and Thetis informs her son. Zeus sends Iris to Troy to tell King Priam, who she finds smeared in dung and mourning his son, that the father of gods and men commands him to ransom his son from Achilles. Priam, despite the protestations of his wife, obeys the goddess and prepares to leave. Priam leaves Troy on his chariot alongside a wagon of treasure. On the plains of Troy, Priam is met by Hermes under the guise of a Myrmidon, who guides him into the Achaean camp. Hermes reveals himself to Priam and tells the king of Troy to go into Achilles' tent and hug his knees. Priam does as he is told, and hugging the knees of Achilles, kisses his hands, those terrible man-killing hands that slaughtered Priam's many sons in battle. Priam exhorts Achilles to remember his own father, Peleus, and Achilles thinks of his father and weeps with Priam. Priam asks for the body of Hector, and though Achilles warns Priam not to tempt his rage, Achilles has the body of Hector washed and carries it to the wagon himself. Achilles promises King Priam that the Achaeans will wait 12 days before restarting the war to allow Troy to bury Prince Hector. Priam sleeps on the porch outside the lodge of Achilles, and Hermes wakes him to send him home before Agamemnon finds him. Priam returns home to Troy, and Troy is plunged into uncontrollable grief. For 9 days, the Trojans hauled in boundless stores of timber for the funeral pyre of Hector. On the 10th day, they set the body of Hector aloft on the pyre's crest, and flung a torch and set it all aflame. The next day, the Trojans bury Hector's bones in a golden chest and end the rites with a splendid funeral feast. And thus, Homer ends the Iliad with the burial of Hector, breaker of horses.
Welcome to Ascend the Great Books podcast. We are so glad that you've tuned in to the last book of the Iliad. You've been waiting 6 months. We've been waiting 6 months. In the year of Homer, for Ascend the Great Books podcast, perhaps you are a lover of good poems. Perhaps you appreciate not fighting at nighttime. Perhaps you enjoy building a horse and it never being recorded in a great book. Or perhaps you enjoy two middle-aged men talking about one of the earliest poems of all time. Regardless of why you are here, we are glad you're here with us on Ascend the Great Books podcast. I'm Adam Minihan with Deacon Garlick. We are here on the last book of the Iliad.
Last one.
Did you think we were going to make it?
Oh, I had some faith.
I mean, we've had some trials and some tribulations with the podcast and like trying to make sure that we were actually going to get this thing off the ground and make sure that after we actually started that it was actually going to see the light of day.
And we've kind of warmed up, so thank you to everyone who has listened for 6 months as we've kind of figured out this dance.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, this is the thing. Whenever you get in front of a microphone, regardless of whether you're like, I'm just acting like myself. Anybody who gets in front of a microphone, as soon as that happens, they're always subconscious or they're always trying to figure out, like, how do I talk with another person? All of a sudden, like, all these normal things that happen throughout the day that you do all the time, like talking to your friends. You put a microphone in front of somebody and all of a sudden, like, I'm not sure how to communicate with people.
Right.
Which is really weird.
So,
but we are here.
We are here. We made it 6 months into the Iliad. So, I mean, so here's the question I've been really wanting to ask.
Okay.
So you're a first-time reader.
Yes.
It just ends.
It ends.
How did you, were you reading this? So let me divulge where I am.
Okay.
So the first time I was reading this, I felt so stupid. I didn't know how it ended, right? So I had kept it secret, like this, over 2,000-year-old, 2,800-year-old text,
Dude,
right?
you are your epithet would be like Deacon Garlick, the keeper of secrets.
Sure, the unknower of things. Right? So what was really interesting is that, like, I remember reading it. I think I might have been on a plane. And just think to myself, like, man, Homer must really pick up the pace here pretty quick because, like,
I mean,
we are just dragging. And it actually really, like, I didn't really, like, everyone usually has, like, a strong emotional reaction to Priam and Achilles.
Right.
I was like, what are we doing? Like,
We don't have time for this.
yeah, I was like, what are we doing? Why is he trying? Like, man, like, is the Trojan horse just a few pages?
We have 25 pages. Let's go.
No, seriously, that's what I was thinking. I was like, and it just ended, and I felt so stupid. I was like, okay, this poem literally was written like 2,800 years ago, and I did not know that the Trojan horse is not in this book.
I did not see that coming.
Culture lied to me. Right? Because you think about, I mean, this is interesting. You think about, oh, the Iliad, what's that about? Achilles, and there's the Trojan horse.
Right. Yeah.
That's it.
Totally. Absolutely. There were so many things that I that I had questions by the time I ended the book. Like there was more questions probably that spurred that.
Yeah. Troy doesn't fall.
Troy doesn't fall.
Achilles doesn't die.
Achilles doesn't die. Where the heck is Ajax? Where the heck is, like Paris? What's happening? Like where is the arrow in the Achilles heel?
Right.
Like, there's so many things where you're just like, wait a minute, time out. Like, I thought this was going to end one way, and it is ending totally. It just ended. It stopped.
Right. So, yeah. So, I mean, any thoughts like as you were reading this for the first time?
Well, like right before we were recording, I mentioned that I thought it was very interesting. So the very beginning of the book, we talked about like, what is the book about?
Mm-hmm.
Like what's the first lines of the Iliad? It's about the rage of Achilles, right? And like this whole time we've been tracking a lot about the deification kind of Achilles, the rage of Achilles, the pinnacle that he's the bell curve has reached its plateau and it has gone back down. And so this is, I think, the importance of being able to read it with other people, especially for a first time read, right? Because while I think I would have probably tracked the idea, like this idea of Achilles in his rage, I don't know that if I would have put all the pieces or connected the dots as well as with reading it with you and our other buddies on our Sunday Great Books, because I came to the realization very quickly, like, oh yeah, well, basically, his rage kind of ends. Mm-hmm. Because everybody's dead, and he knows like he's up next. He's on deck
To die.
Yeah, and so that makes sense. Like if the book is about the rage of Achilles, once the rage of Achilles is complete, the book is finished. Now, that's not necessarily satisfactory.
Right.
There's this lack of satisfaction in some of the other things that I want to know about, right? Which we'll discuss and talk about as we go. But I found Priam to kind of redeem himself a little bit in some fashions. I found, I know that most people don't have this view, but I had a little bit of like, okay, Achilles, like, I'm glad you turned the body back over. Like there's a few things where I was like, okay, good. This is a good move.
Yeah, I might actually push into that and say that there's a lot of people, I think, who take a very pro Achilles stance in the Iliad. Mm-hmm. Even some like very famous commentators, right, who do see Achilles as the noble hero who. This scene with Priam really is like a full redemption scene, right? Like he's fully redeemed in this scene.
Yeah, and I think I would probably push back a little bit on the full redemption. I'm more hesitant. I think would be probably a better word of saying like he's fully redeemed.
Yeah, I'd like to ask two questions that we can maybe throw out there, and then when we get to it, we'll parse out. One is, I do think it's a redemption scene, but from what and to what? Like, what is he actually being redeemed from?
Yeah.
And what is he returning to? And I think that's something to ask, because I think we need to put this in context, right? And then the second one, and I just completely forgot what I was going to say.
that happens. Again, when you put a microphone in front of you, all of a sudden you short circuit. But I do
That's
think
true. I just got really nervous.
I do think that the idea of piety plays a big role here as well. And I did think that I would not have picked this up again if it wasn't for your show notes, which you can find on us in thegreatbookspodcast.com. This is something kind of a benefit that we have been doing over the last 6 months of going through a slow read of the Iliad, is that if you're wanting to read this with a group, if you're wanting to read this with your college buddies, if you're wanting to read this with your friends that are dads that you're trying to learn before your kids get old enough to where you can pass this on to them, or if you're a retired guy who realized that you were robbed of some of the great books, opportunity to read some of the great books. Like, regardless of where you are in your life journey, this is not something that is for just one specific person or just one specific demographic. We made this guide, and when I say I'm going to take 100% credit for this. This is something that I really put a lot of time and effort and energy into.
I appreciate you allowing me to read the opening.
Yeah, you're welcome. Like, you butchered a couple names throughout the weeks, but I let that slide in my charity. And but in all honesty, to be honest, obviously Deacon Garlick spent a lot of time putting this guide together, and there's over 150, or there's about 115 questions that we walk through with the Iliad. And it really is truly, like, if this is your first time reading, or if this is like the 17th time that you've read this book, with these guides, with the guide that you've provided, it really does help you connect and make you start thinking about things maybe that you haven't actually thought about. And don't be prideful. Don't be prideful. Don't pull a Hector.
All right. Let's get into the text.
I thought you'd push back on that.
No, I'm just gonna allow you to do your thing.
Okay.
Because I think we have a lot to
unpack. Yeah,
through.
But I do want to give you props for the guide. Even book 24, the guide for book 24 alone, I think is worth the money for admission, which we're not charging anything for anyway, out of our charity. And really, when I say our charity, I mean really it's my charity. But the guide is really helps tie up some loose ends, helps facilitate good conversation between friends.
Yeah, I think it could be used as the original intent, I think, of the guide was one, because there's actually, despite these books being out for so long, just in the great books in general, I think there's a real dearth of critical editions that actually really help you walk through the text, like in a really deep, meaningful way. There's a few, but they're uncommon. And two, the other thing that we see constantly, and I'm in dialogue with people on Twitter about, is that people want to read these books. They want to even do it in fraternity. They want to have small groups. But what do you do if you got 3 or 4 of you that are like, yeah, we'll commit to read the Iliad, but no one's read it before, and no one feels like they can be like, the first amongst equals who's actually going to like lead the conversation.
Right.
Then I think the guide in that question and answer format, which is why we approach that, which is the most common way that we learn. I think it's a very natural way that we learn. Can serve as that guide, if you will. Right. Okay.
Absolutely.
So getting into the text, speaking of the guide, we have book 24 opens. And what's interesting is here, right at the end of the narrative, Homer reveals to us why Athena and Hera hate Troy.
Yeah, and even before that, could you go ahead and read lines 7 and 8, if you would, please? Sure.
This is your question that you have? Yeah. Okay, so Adam's really wanting to get into this. So anyway, Achilles, right, he's grieving for his friend, and then he says, not now, he turned and twisted side to side. He longed for Patroclus's manhood, his gallant heart. What rough campaigns they had fought to end together. What hardships they had suffered, cleaving their way through wars of men and pounding waves of seas. The memories flooded over him, live tears flowing, and now he'd lie on his side, now flat on his back, now face down again. So, obviously, I'll just intuit what I think you want to talk about. So,
I'm actually doing this strategically.
Which we've already discussed in the podcast, which is the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. oftentimes you will see modern reads. So this is talked about in the guide. I want to point out, make a few caveats.
Okay.
One, we've talked about this at length in the podcast, so I'm not going to give a full exhaustive thing here.
But for those who are
right. Two, it's also
just tuning in,
written out in the guide. So like, if you want to say like, well, that's Deacon Garlick and he's a Catholic and he's trying to, maybe like bleach some history and whatever, like go check out the guide because I cite the sources, right?
You have receipts.
I have the receipts, son. So the point here is that a lot of people will end up reading Patroclus and Achilles as homosexuals, right? And I think this is a misread for many, many reasons. It's very common now in the modern era for, obviously, for obvious reasons, right? Why I think this is, in retrospect, looked like this. I think one is that it's really hard for us to accept any type of deep, intimate, fraternal relationship between men, right? It has to be erotic, right? It has to be. And you actually see this is read all the time. They can't handle a relationship between, say, Jonathan and King David either, right? That one has to be homosexual. I'm sure there's other examples that you can give, but we just don't do this, right? In a lot of ways, I think.
Even Jesus and St. John.
That's true. You have, God forgive us for even mentioning it, but there have been these reads, and really what ends up happening is that you can't have this like deep, intimate relationship between men without it being reread in some type of homosexual way.
That's right.
Now, to push back on this, because I think it's a more complicated narrative, that this is not simply like, oh, well, now we have these modern movements on anthropology and they're just like randomly picking relationships in history and trying to like reboot them as like, some type of, same-sex relation. I don't think that's actually the case in this particular circumstance, because when you read the classical Greeks, and what I mean by that is like the 400s, right, going into the 300s. When you read those Greeks, Patroclus and Achilles are presented as homosexual lovers, right? So this is also an ancient read as well. And so even though, and this is one of the things like with the receipts on the guide, however, whether or not Achilles and Patroclus were in like a sexual relationship was even a debate in the classical period, right? And basically what a lot of the commentators, even the ancient commentators, would note is that homosexuality comes to Athens, right? And as we see like in the Platonic writings, homosexuality comes to Athens and becomes incredibly popular amongst the aristocratic class, right? And we also get a lot of pederasty, right? These older men that are taking younger men as like their mentees, right? So because it's not just like the sexual component, it's like, they take them under their wing, and that's like a part of it, right? And then you
look at Aristophanes.
Right. You get Plato's Symposium is the best way to see this, right? A lot of the speeches that are given in Plato's Symposium are pro-pederast, right? As they're trying to explain eros.
Right.
So the complicated thing here, and I think Plato pushes out against that, right? Plato doesn't actually follow that. I think a close read of Symposium, right, is that he's actually reordering eros, right, away from that disordered eros. And then particularly in his laws, he explicitly talks about homosexuality and it being disordered, right?
Bro, I cannot wait to do a long read on the Symposium.
This could be great. We're going to get there eventually, but it's going to be wonderful. Actually, I'm thinking about having a symposium on the Symposium and doing like multiple episodes with different people, like different facets. So, but to stay on target, so even in like that time period, right, there's like the librarian at the Library of Alexandria is writing about how the classical Greeks are projecting, right, these new kind of homosexual relations and standards onto Homer, where this clearly does not exist. And also, by the way, with this kind of like rise of homosexuality, it's very much coupled then with a very much reduced view of women as well. And you could say like, well, do you see that in Homer? Well, you also, you do have slaves and concubines and things of that nature, but you really don't see that, like how wives are talked about, and then particularly when you get into the Odyssey and you look at like the role of Penelope and stuff like this classical Greek 400s aristocratic homosexuality is not present in Homer.
Right.
So a lot of people and a lot of scholars, if you're not just trying to be popular and et cetera, I think will point out that like trying to read this back into Achilles and Patroclus is a misread, even though it's you can't just blame this on like, this is a modern misread. This is also a classical misread as well. And there's really, by the way, there's no real reason to run interference on this. I mean, if, obviously like when we read Plato, there's lots of homosexual and pederasty in the text. And there's no reason to try and whitewash that and say it's not there. I think that would be a grave injustice to the text. We need to take the text the way they are. But I do think, as we read this one, I just do think it's a misread. I follow a lot of scholars that and I realize in popular culture, that's not how it's done. But even people misunderstand Plato. Right? And how that's done as well, right? They just know the Greeks had this like relationship and they assume Socrates and Plato and Aristotle followed into that, and I don't think that's actually true either. Yeah. So anyway, if that's like a sticking point, or you're like, are we just trying to like bleach this out, or what are we doing? I would say go to the guide, look at it. It's something that we pulled multiple sources on. Because even if they were, then we need to address the text the way they are. Right, and we need to address that. I mean, there's nothing there's no reason to run interference.
This is why I actually brought it up. I know, like the little boy in me, like was trying to like not to snicker, or be like read lines 7 and 8.
I mean, it isn't awkward for modern ears. It's awkward, and I can't remember. I looked it up in Latimer as well. Right, he longed for Patroclus's manhood, and obviously for us, that's a euphemism. Right. For moderns, we hear that as a euphemism. Right. But that's not what it's talking about here. It's very clearly talking about his masculinity in that fraternal relationship, because it's in the context of his gallant heart. And then they talk about all these campaigns and wars and battles that they've fought together. Right. Well,
and I also wanted to give it an opportunity to pitch the guide, because you do go through in great depth of the sources on this topic. So anyway, okay, yeah. So we're talking about Athena and Hera and like why they actually the reasons that they hate Troy. Like we're finally like what?
Right.
But we're in the last book.
So we're in book 24. So hopefully you've been keeping this in your mind that we don't actually know yet why Hera and Athena hate Troy. So kind of turning to the guide, because I think there's a fascinating backstory here. Yeah. Right. So, so if you notice, Hera states she brought up Thetis, right, and gave her in marriage to a mortal, King Peleus. That's line 72. So we're getting a little bit of this backstory. So the story goes that Zeus loved Thetis, and the Titan Prometheus told him that Thetis was destined to bear a son greater than his father. So, of course, like Zeus isn't going to take this. So, as such, Zeus gives Thetis to Peleus, a mortal. So the son would also be mortal, right? So they realize, so all the gods because I think there's also a part of the legend there is that I think Poseidon also wanted Thetis. And all of a sudden they get this prophecy and they're like, okay, never mind. Like now she becomes not just like an object of my desire, but now she becomes a problem. And we actually need to make sure that she actually marries like a mortal.
Would have been nice if everybody would have taken that same thoughts with Helen, because the book wouldn't have been in existence.
It would have been slightly different.
Yeah.
So Homer's reference to Hera's role in the Iliad implies that she also had some part in this scheme as well, right? So Peleus has to wrestle the immortal sea nymph Thetis as she changed shapes to win her heart. He's successful, and so the gods, through a grand marriage, right? So now they're going through this wonderful marriage. And again, this is all the way before the Iliad. So all the gods are invited to the wedding except for the goddess of discord, which naturally probably makes sense to everybody.
Yep.
So I actually think this is a fascinatingly clever myth. So Discord arrived at the wedding, regardless, and tossed in a golden apple for the most beautiful goddess.
So Discord was the first wedding crasher.
Sure. Again, the insights that you have are...
It's incredible.
Yeah, I like that. So she throws in this golden apple, for the most beautiful goddess. So immediately, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite all claim the prize, and of course, then immediately discord, strife, pops up in the middle of the wedding. So then they ask Zeus to judge between them, but very wisely, he refused to have anything to do with the matter. Right? So Zeus is not an idiot. Yeah. Zeus instead recommends the goddesses present themselves to Paris, the Trojan prince, right? Who he says is an excellent judge of beauty. So notice here, like Zeus starting to already work these machinations. So you can say like Zeus gave Troy to Hera. Remember that? Remember she's like, oh, this is a gift to you. But when you know the backstory, Zeus is starting to lay this foundation way before. Like he knows who Paris is. He knows how this is going to work out. So Paris, however, was in exile from Troy because Priam received a prophecy that Paris would be the ruin of his country. So the goddesses presented themselves to Paris and offered him gifts or bribes, depending on how you look at it, right? To choose the most beautiful. So Hera promised to make him the lord of all Europe and Asia. Athena, that he would lead the Trojans against the Greeks and lay Greece in ruins. So think about that.
Yep.
And Aphrodite, that the fairest woman in all the world should be his. Paris was awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite, who in turn offered him Helen of Sparta, who already happened to be married to the king of Sparta, Menelaus. Right. So this is our backstory. And Paris chose, I think, this very adolescent choice. Right. But I think it's fascinating that because again, we're so used to Athena being antagonistic towards Troy.
Right.
But she has no allegiance to Troy at all. She actually offered up Troy, right? Troy could have been, victorious over the Greeks if he would have picked her, right? So anyway.
But Paris, once again,
really ruins everything.
Screws the pooch.
He does, yes. So anyway, this wonderful backstory is given to us all the way at the end, right, of book 24.
Yeah.
Which, there's different ways of reading this. So like you can read a lot of other guides that will give you all of these myths on the front end. And obviously their thesis there is that Homer's ancient audience would have already known these myths, right? So it's not an actual like plot development to a certain degree.
Right.
But I do, one of the reasons, and I talk about this at the beginning of the guide, one of the reasons that we don't do that is because I think it helps us to sharpen our attentive reading, that we are keeping in mind or even notice, why do Hera and Athena even hate Troy? Like, have we been even keeping that in mind?
Yeah.
Because I remember reading it and you're like on book 12, and you're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Why do they hate people? So anyway, so that's our backstory there. Right. So Apollo gets us kicked off, right? Because he's...
Yeah, where are you?
This is a little bit before line 40.
Oh, okay.
So Apollo gets us kicked off by basically chastising the gods and being like, listen, did Hector never burn thighs in your honor? But murderous Achilles, you gods, you choose to help Achilles, the man without a shred of decency in his heart. So Apollo, starts to actually kind of like, push this. And there's a wonderful line.
He lays it on pretty thick.
He does. And there's a wonderful line a little bit before 60 in which it says, the fates have given mortals hearts that can endure. Right? It's a wonderful line. The fates have given mortals hearts that can endure. Hera rages at him. So, I mean, that's not uncharacteristic. But it's really interesting, the argument she makes. It really is a distinction in kind. She basically argues like Hector's immortal. So regardless of like which one's more pious, they're in different categories. Like sure, Hector can be really pious for a mortal, and technically Achilles is mortal too, but notice she's like, listen, he was nursed at a woman's breast. Achilles sprang from a goddess. They're not the same. So he might be...
One I reared myself.
Right. And then that goes back, right? I brought her up and gave her in marriage to a man. So she makes this like, really interesting argument, which I don't think is going to be shocking to anyone, that the gods look after their own. But like, it doesn't matter if Hector's incredibly pious towards the gods. He's in a different category than Achilles, who is a demigod. And Zeus basically makes that argument when he answers Hera that, listen, they're just in different categories. So, but then Zeus does decide a little after 90 that Achilles must receive a ransom from King Priam, and Achilles has to give the body back. So Iris goes and plays the messenger.
Right before that, can I just ask a quick question on 90? Like it says, for Thetis was always there, his mother always hovering near him night and day. I found that to be interesting. Like that. Like I don't find that as a hard to believe necessarily at times, but then like, have you been reading the last 591 pages? There have been times where it's like, well, why, as a mother, why would you not have done X, Y, or Z?
But she does seem to be very involved with him, right?
Yeah.
And she runs...
It just was like,
She runs interference.
Right.
She's an intercessor.
It does seem like that. It shows that she does run. She is an intercessor at times. But then there's also other times it's like, man, if you are really truly there night and day, it would have been nice to have been there during this time.
Right.
But I just thought that was an interesting insight.
No, it is. So another interesting insight, I think, is that then when Thetis is called, so this is like 125 or so, note that Thetis took a seat beside the father, the throne Athena yielded.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one, we know that Athena has that throne, right? She sits basically at the right hand of Zeus. She constantly has his shield. I mean, she is very intimately tied to her father. But it's just interesting that when Thetis is called to talk to Zeus, she gives up that throne, right? I'm not entirely sure how much weight I want to put in that, but I think it was something interesting. So Zeus is telling Thetis, like, hey, listen, this is what you have to do. Like, Achilles has to give up the body of Hector. I think it's really fascinating around like 135, right? He's like, they keep urging the sharp-eyed giant killer Hermes to go and steal the body, right? Just go and steal it. But that's not my way. I will grant Achilles glory, and so safeguard your awe and love for me for all the years to come. So there's two things. One, we are seeing, in a lot of ways, the fruition and final completion of the promise of Thetis, right? That really gave a lot of structure to this text.
Yeah.
Two, like I just put a note out there, what about Sarpedon? Like you totally just stole his body, right? He's like, oh, that's not my way. Well, you totally stole his body and just zipped it off to his home to have a proper burial. So, the promise of Thetis is coming to its completion. They're going to give gifts to melt his rage. We still need to watch the theme of rage. Like it seems to be placated. We threw out the thesis last week that his kind of like arc of deification via the medium of rage
was in the downslope.
Yeah, it peaked with the human sacrifice, and now it's coming down. So Thetis takes this. She goes. She tells Achilles. Achilles, like always, is incredibly deferential to the gods, right?
So be it.
Yeah, because you really kind of think about like how is he going to take this, given his rage, what he's done with Achilles, etc. In a certain way, you can say, well, he's just very deferential. In another way, he has to know something's going on because he keeps dragging this guy around, and the guy's body is still sitting there immaculate.
Right.
Not only was it protected, but it also was healed.
Right.
So he's just, Hector's just sitting there looking like he's asleep. So Achilles has to have some inkling that the gods are involved here. Right?
Something's happening.
Something is going on. So, and then Iris goes and tells Priam, right, what Priam actually has to do. He's laying in a dung heap, right? He's in mourning. And basically tells him that he's supposed to go. He'll meet Hermes.
How did you feel when you read that for the first time?
It kind of like a Job. Yeah. I don't remember Job doing that, but he definitely remember he takes like the pot shard and cuts himself and covers himself. And he's cutting the boils off. He's not cutting. He's not mutilating himself, but and covering himself in ash. He cuts his hair. So I mean, I just took it as obviously it's a
tough thing to read.
Yeah, it's a sign. Well, particularly like here's the king. Right. What does this mean for the polis? What does it mean for his grief?
Because, passing things on is a big deal in your bloodline.
And he has 50 sons. I don't think he thought this was going to be his problem.
Right.
But they've been, slaughtered. And then the ones he has, we'll see, he's not overly favorable towards.
Right.
So Priam, I think we need to note here that Priam basically says yes, like he accepts, right? And then the wife, right, but he does kind of say like, okay, wife, what should I do? What do you think? The wife says like, you've gone mad, right? There's a really interesting parallel at like 253 or so in which Hecuba unknowingly reiterates the words of Achilles. Oh, would to God that I could sink my teeth into his liver and eat him raw, right? Hecuba, if I remember correctly, ends up in the medieval world becoming like the stand-in for insanity. Like she becomes like the woman who like can't take like the fall of Troy, like everyone dies, like she goes insane. And so I actually made a note here, like, is this the beginning, like that pressure?
Of her insanity?
Is this like the beginning of her starting to go down that path? Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, it's also interesting. Like, I found it very noble of Priam to like consult his wife and be like, wife, what do you think about this?
Mm-hmm.
And then I thought, like, man, if I was him and my wife told me that, it would be very hard for me to do what he did. And so, like, I kind of gave him a little bit of like, last week and the week before, I kind of gave him some flack for like giving some pretty bad speeches to Hector and things like that.
Right.
But like here, I think it shows a little bit of character of Priam. Like, even though like the woman that he loves tells him like, hey, I think you're absolutely insane.
Right.
He still carries forward.
And it becomes a question of piety, right?
Right.
Like, so wait, do I honor my wife's wishes? Do I honor the gods? And he basically says, listen, I heard her voice with my own ears. I looked straight at the goddess face to face.
Right.
Now, I think we need to pause or like kind of put this in the parking lot a bit, because then it kind of develops and it's an odd development. But right now he seems to hold the line and say, nope, listen, I saw the gods face to face. I know what I need to do.
Yeah.
So he goes into the treasury. He gets the treasures. Around two, these are the treasures, obviously, he's going to put in the wagon and take the ransom, Hector. 290, he says, but before I have to see my city annihilated, laid waste before my eyes, oh, let me go down to the house of death. I just marked that because it's the exact same thing that Hector requests, right? And is given to him. Right.
So do you find that to be... do you find that to be noble, or do you find that to be like... do you find that to be like you're being a coward?
It's hard for me to interpret it in a way that I find to be naturally virtuous.
Right. It's like, listen, you're the captain of the ship. When the ship is going down,
right?
You're the captain. Like, you are the king.
But even like on Hector's level, like I still kind of struggle for that sentiment. I mean, there's one thing to say is like, there's one thing. It's one thing to say like, I will die, before I see Troy fall, right? Like, I will just give it my all.
That's one thing, but it's another thing to wish. Like, may I die before the place that I'm in charge of.
Both he and Hector seem to have a slightly different tone. Right. And even when Hector said it, it didn't set terribly well with me, because he's like, well, listen, you're probably going to get sold into slavery and scream a bunch, and all the women are, and I just hope I die before I have to do that. And he's kind of disjointed, because then when it goes to his son, right, then he kind of shifts gears and prays to Zeus that his son will be a better man than he is. Right. So he's not entirely consistent on how he's going to do that. So I did note, regardless of how you read those, it's very interesting that both father and son basically articulate the same thing. Mm-hmm. For Hector, that promise was given. For Priam, it will not be. Mm-hmm. Right. So then he gets a lashing out of his sons. Right, so like, who's alive here? We've got like Helenus. Remember, he's like the seer. Paris, Agathon, a few others. Anyone we know here? Oh, Deiphobus is still alive, right? The one that Athena took the appearance of. There's 9 of them, so I guess
that's not very good odds. 9 out of 50. Yeah,
it's unclear. Like, are these like literally all the sons, or there's at least 9 here? Like, I'm not sure if this is an exhaustive list. But he very clearly does not like them, right? Mm-hmm. He's cursing their sight, right? If only you'd been killed, right, instead of dear Hector. This is like somewhat of a Lord of the Rings moment with the Steward of Gondor and the Boromir narrative, right? If you're familiar with all that. So he's like, I wish that Hector would be alive and you all had died. It was hard for me not to connect this passage with my earlier inclinations and unease with why none of Hector's brothers were actually offering him aid when he was running around Troy.
Yeah.
And then obviously you couple that with the fact that Athena then takes the shape of one of his brothers, someone that he trusts and so eager to see help him. Right. But they're all disgraced.
And then it is abandoned.
Yeah, but they're all disgrace. He actually calls them this, right? They're disgraces, they're liars. I actually love this. They're disgraces, liars, and dancers, right? I have a bunch of dancers left over, which is really hard not to see that as a
Sometimes you have to express yourself through the art of dance, okay? Right. Sometimes you have to.
So then, what I talked about earlier with the wife, like 335, so Hecuba Yeah, so people who just listen to the podcast can't see all the times you look into the camera and give them like the little like Jim from The Office look because you've said something clever as I just continue to focus on the text, which is fine. We all have a part to play. So, again, so Priam gets the message from the goddess. He asks the wife what to do. Hecuba says, "You're insane."
Mm-hmm.
He says, "I saw the goddess face to face." Now Hecuba comes up with like a golden cup of honeyed wine saying, "No, hey, you need to pour out a libation to Father Zeus before you go." But then she asks him to pray for a bird omen, right? And she says, "So you can see that sign with your own eyes." And he agrees to do this. And so he washes he washes water over his hands, which we should connect that to Hector. Remember, Hector won't pour a libation because his hands are full of the grime of war.
Yep.
And then Priam offers the libation so he can see with his own eyes. And Zeus does launch an eagle. And it's very clear that there's a bunch of people here, right? All looked up, overjoyed, and the people's spirits lifted. So the question that I have is, why does he do this? Like, he literally just said, "I saw the goddess face to face. I know what I'm supposed to do."
And yet now he's like, "Let me see the bird."
Yeah. This is like, who was that? Like Gideon, where it's like, okay, well, first, make the fleece wet and everything around it dry. And then okay, well, never mind. Why don't you make the fleece dry? And,
Everything.
it's like, we're just going to like keep, and so.
You're doubling down every time,
Right. Is that this? Or when I first read it, what occurred to me is that this isn't for Priam at all. Like, Priam's already convinced what he's doing. His wife is saying, "You need to do this so you could know," but Priam already knows. And Priam as king is doing it so everyone else can know, right? All looked up and all, rejoiced. So I thought this was more, that might be too pro Priam here. Maybe he is kind of wavering.
Did he need it?
But I don't think he needed it. And he just saw the goddess face to face.
Yeah, but does he need the other's approval? He already, to me, I read this as the man, I was giving him a defense here, right? The man is steadfast in his ways, even though his wife has said you shouldn't do it. It's I already know what I'm supposed to do.
Right.
I don't know. I think that's an interesting thought, because if he did need it and he wavered, that shows that his wife kind of got to him a little bit.
Yeah, that could be it.
Or he just needs everybody else's approval.
Yeah, or it has to be doubled down for some reason. So there's an interesting dance going on in that text.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to flag it. So let's see. So Hermes is sent down to be the escort, which, by the way, is one of Hermes' roles, right? He escorts a lot of men to the underworld and things like this. So he is like a guide, right? That's kind of like a role he plays. So they go out in the plains of Troy. So it's Priam, and then they have a wagon. There's another guy, right? And it's full of wagon treasure. Mm-hmm. They run into Hermes, but he is, in appearance of a Myrmidon. And so there's this back and forth with them. I think it's kind of interesting because Priam, keep in mind, already knows that Hermes is going to be his guide. Iris told him that explicitly. Mm-hmm. So there's this kind of
And this is the second time that he's come up as a Myrmidon, right?
What was the first time?
It was...
I don't remember.
The last book, right?
That Hermes came up as a Myrmidon?
Or was it a different goddess or god? Somebody already came up as a Myrmidon.
Oh, no, it's not occurring to me.
Gosh, dadgummit.
Maybe it's too late at night.
Yeah, I just find it interesting that why is it Myrmidons? That was actually my question. Is I think this is the second time that somebody has appeared as a Myrmidon, and so
my rough take there would just simply because he wants to be taken to Achilles, right?
And because he knows where it is. But everybody should know where Achilles is. He's one of the best warriors. Is there something about the Myrmidons, which we'll find out later, make it
Well, this is where I think it's not only that he can be taken to Achilles, but he can be, because he's a Myrmidon and he's camping with the Myrmidons, he can give Priam a comment of what Hector's body is like. And this is what he does at 495, which might have been... So I might have jumped the gun last week and talked about the fact that all of Hector's wounds have been healed. We've talked that twice. I don't think actually it's mentioned that explicitly. And this is actually where it says it explicitly, right? All his wounds sealed shut wherever they struck, and many drove their bronze blades through his body, right? So not only, so he has that healing effect and he's been protected, right? So anyway, I think that's what I would say is that he presented as a Myrmidon because not only are they going to Achilles, but then also because it allows him, excuse me, to give an update on Hector. Now, the fact that Priam is expecting Hermes to be his guide, right, lends, I think, another layer to the fact of like this conversation. The piety too, so 505. Like one of the questions here is like, what did Hector's piety even afford him, right? And so here it's interesting. Priam's like, never once in his halls did he forget the gods who hold Olympus, never. So now they remember him, ellipses, if only after death, right? So here's like where Hector's piety comes cashing in. Like, is he on the same level as Achilles? No, he's not. But the gods do remember him, right? He is dear to the heart of Zeus.
Yeah.
So, and dear to the heart of his own father, right? Which is what we're seeing now. So anyway, they are moving on. One thing that did catch my attention, and I'm actually not, I don't have an answer to this, is 529. It talks about they come to the lodge of Achilles. The Myrmidons built their king. But Peleus is still alive, who is their king. So I didn't know. I mean, Odysseus is king of Ithaca, even though Laertes, his father, is alive. But I guess I might have missed it. I don't remember. I thought they talked about King Peleus in the past, and I have not been. And maybe it's just a misread, or maybe I need to work on my own attentive reading. I have not been contextualizing Achilles as the king of the Myrmidons. So the Myrmidons are his tribe, right?
Right.
I have not been doing that. So that really caught my attention when they talked about they built their king. And I don't know. Maybe that's more of just that's not a literal king. But anyway, it's just something I noted in the text because it caught me off guard.
Yeah.
So he tells him Hermes is, he says, I'm immortal Hermes. So, okay, thanks. 541.
Yeah.
And he tells him, but you go in and clasp Achilles' knees. Okay, we've seen this several times. It has not worked out well. You get your liver split open.
Right.
Implore him by his father, his mother with lovely hair, by his own son, so you can stir his heart. So again, this is a piety argument.
Yeah.
Right?
Which didn't work out well for Hector.
Yeah, there's a great connection there. You're correct, right? Hector tries to make almost basically the exact same appeal when he's dying, right? Remember your parents. Please let my people bury me. So in certain ways, Priam now is carrying out the same argument, and Achilles has now a second chance to actually make right on that. So he does. He goes in. This is like 560. The majestic king of Troy slept past the rest, and kneeling down beside Achilles, clasped his knees and kissed his hands, those terrible man-killing hands that had slaughtered Priam's many sons in battle. And so Achilles marveled, beholding majestic Priam. And then first thing out of his mouth, right? 570. Remember your own father, great godlike Achilles, as old as I am, passed through the threshold of deadly age. No doubt the countrymen round him plague him now, with no one there to defend him, beat away disaster. No one, but at least he hears you're still alive, and his old heart rejoices. Hope. I mean, he lays this on thick, right? Getting Achilles in this very imaginative way to remember his own father, right?
Do you think Achilles marveled at the fact that, holy crap, you're here? Or like marveled at, like, because he says the majestic Priam, like because of his office?
I'm not sure those are inseparable, right? Because it's just like, oh, here's the king of Troy.
Right.
But also you're in my lodge. How did you even get here?
Okay, yeah, that's
right.
A good point.
But also keep in mind though, Achilles knows he's coming.
Right.
Right. So this is the same thing of like Priam also knows Hermes is going to be his guide. So this is where you really have to pay attention to. Homer likes doing this a lot of like the messenger comes. What does the messenger say? And then how does it play out? Right. So like, maybe Achilles doesn't know all the details, but like he knows he has to give the body back. Right. He's already preparing for that. Also, I don't think, could be corrected, Priam does not know that the gods have already instructed Achilles to do this, right? Priam's been told to go do this. You have to go ransom the body back,
Right.
But Achilles. So it's unclear to me. Maybe I could go back and read it. Like that Priam thinks that he's the one that's like pitching this idea, right? Like the gods have said, but the gods have done both. They told Priam and Achilles, right? They've kind of orchestrated this thing, and so Achilles knows, right, that he's going to have to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so Priam makes this argument, one of piety, remember your parents, really remember your father, I would say is probably the stronger argument that he makes here. He also tells him to revere the gods, right? So we're kind of working through our kind of ladder of piety, if you will. And then, one of the most famous lines, 591, I put to my lips the hands of the man who killed my son.
Yeah.
And this works, right? This kind of cracks open Achilles' heart. His heart stirs. There's a deep desire to grieve for his own father. Taking the old man's hand, he gently moved him back, and overwhelmed by memory, both men gave way to grief. Priam wept freely for man-killing Hector, throbbing, crouching before Achilles' feet, as Achilles wept himself, now for his father, now for Patroclus once again. The sobbing rose and fell throughout the house.
Okay, so go ahead. No.
So I think that there's a few things here. Where do we see this? I think we asked the question, like, is this a redemption? What is this?
Right.
So I think that the first thing I would say is if the sacrifice of the Trojans at Patroclus' funeral was the peak of that deification through the medium of rage,
right,
this is clearly Odysseus re-entering humanity.
Odysseus?
Oh, sorry. Why did I say Odysseus? It's too late. This is Achilles. Re-entering humanity, right? Like this is him coming down, remembering his father. I think it's quite interesting that what warms his heart, right, and kind of breaks his rage or melts his rage, as Zeus says, is an appeal to his father, not his mother. His mother is immortal, right? It's an appeal to his human side, right? Peleus, his father, is literally his human side. It's an appeal to his human side,
right?
That is the avenue by which that they can start to melt his rage. And so I think like we're seeing this arc come down. This is his descent back into humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that earlier you asked, right, like, well, is it a redemption scene? I would say yes. What is he being redeemed from? I think that godlike rage, right? It is a godlike rage. We see Hera exhibit that, right? We see Ares exhibit this. Like, how many times do we see the rage of the gods motivate them?
Sure.
So I think that this is a redemption from that rage, that divine rage, back into a humanity, right? I don't think it's a scene of repentance.
Okay, that's a good distinction.
Like I don't see that. Now, I'm granted, there are plenty of people who read it as such. So what do I mean by this? I mean that a lot of people read this as like a repentance scene. So like
because he also weeps.
Because he weeps and etc. And so it's like, listen, the Achilles that raged in the river, the Achilles that's done all these things has been wiped away, and this is like a rebirth.
He's coming off of a bender and like he's coming back
this
to
is
reality.
A rebirth. I mean, this is repentance. So what is this? This is like 1100. So, 1,000 years later, St. Paul in Greek is going to talk about a metanoia, right? A turning around, right? A true repentance. And he talks about this in the New Testament. And some people read that as this, right? This is his repentance scene. This is his metanoia, right? He turns. And I think it's just a bridge too far. I think it's a little too deep. I see the redemption back into humanity, right? But two things. One, there's nothing in here about him being sorry for his actions. Why does he weep? He doesn't weep for Hector. He doesn't even weep for Priam.
It's Patroclus.
Right? He weeps for his father and Patroclus. Is that drawing him back into his humanity? Yes. Is it some type of like metanoia for what he's done as this raging, almost inhuman beast throughout the Iliad? I would say no. There are plenty of commentators who would say yes and read Achilles as like a noble figure. I don't see the text manifest that. But I don't think we discard him, I think it is his descent back into humanity. And I think I would couple this too with the fact that, one, factually, what is he actually weeping for? And again, he's not weeping for his sins, to use an anachronistic word here. Two, that rage is still there. So it is percolating, right? It's not that it's like gone away. Earlier you said that it had been placated. I think that's true to a degree. I don't think it's like placated and kind. That's why there's no there's no rebirth here. He is still raging, right? He even warns Priam, right? As we kind of get into this, right? He warns Priam, right? I will literally slaughter you in my own house and break the rules of guest friendship and hospitality if you don't cool it, right? And so that rage is still under the surface. It's not going to take a whole lot for him to come back into that. Yeah. So I don't see it as like this whole like rebirth scene. I do see it as a descent back into his humanity.
Okay. I don't want to push back on that because...
No, I think you should.
Well, again, this is my first time read, right? So the guys who...
So like how... Well, I apologize. You should have given your first time read before I gave all of that. So what...
Well, I agree. I don't disagree with much of what you say.
Right.
Where I think that's interesting is that I don't see a lot of times where gods in general are sorrowful or repentant,
right,
in any way. Right. And so if Achilles is, this hybrid of God like man, is this the closest he can get from his nature as being sorrowful or repentant?
So is the point there that like he's actually still being pretty godlike? Like he hasn't really,
like he's not like, well, yeah, because I think that he still has because he still has part, like even if he comes down into a more human-like person or level or whatever you want to call that, he still has a godlike, like he's still part God.
Yeah,
in some way.
No, I like that. I like that a lot. So maybe we should make a distinction that his descent back into his humanity is not something lower or different than what he was to begin with. And going by Hera's comment, he's still categorically different than like Hector.
Right.
So he's not, no, I like that. So it's not a metamorphosis into like something more human than what he was as a demigod. I think he's just coming down from whatever that arc was that he went up, and it's more of a return. So no, he's still the demigod. I don't think he's becoming any more human than what he was like at the beginning. So
does he have the potential of actually being
like more human?
Like more human. Like does he have the potential of being repentant in that aspect?
Yeah, because one thing is maybe the pushback against is that do we see the gods weep for any reason?
Well, I don't know if. Well, you may see them weep.
Have we seen them
because
weep?
like one of the people that they love doesn't like work out or something like that, and so they I don't know. Like I'm not willing to say that because I have not. This is my first time read, right? So like I don't have that attentive of a read maybe, but I don't. I think I'd be willing to say like I haven't seen thus far at least them repent.
Yeah, the repentance is just not there.
And so, like, even if they're sorrowful, which is sorrowful and repentance, there's a difference there, right? Like in some like nuanced way. So my question is like, is Achilles even capable of that repentance? And if he's not, is this the closest that we can get?
Well, yeah, maybe to recontextualize. The question is, am I not falling into a trap here of looking for, anachronistically a Christian repentance scene, right? Even by my own example of St. Paul's metanoia. True. I do think, though, I don't know if Achilles is capable, given his demigod status and also maybe that's not it full sail, but the fact that he's tethered to rage. I don't know if his rage is going to allow him to do something
to actually
like that.
repent.
Yeah. Now, if you pushed and said, "Well, is the repentance a bridge too far?" Like, are you rereading this in too much of like a Christian manner and expecting too much? I think though we do see at least an acknowledgement of mistakes, right? I mean, you clearly saw that with Hector, right? I should have listened to Polydamas, right? And so, I think that there can be, and then yeah, I mean, even like I don't want to jump ahead too much, but like
We're at the end of the book.
well, at the end of the Odyssey, without going into any narrative detail, right? There's a very clear like penance scene, right? Like you have done something wrong. Now the gods are subscribing that, but like you've done something wrong and you have to go do penance, right? Which clearly
To Odysseus?
yeah, which clearly marks to like a repentance. Like
Yeah, but Odysseus isn't a god or demigod.
No, but I'm just saying, like, do we see in Greek culture, like, to what degree do we see in Greek culture, like, that metanoia?
Right.
Right? That, like, okay, I'm wrong. Right?
And
Because what I don't want to do is, like we've seen in other cases, try and read too much of what is a Christian predicated on grace, right, in the revelation of Jesus Christ.
Right.
When what we're dealing with here, obviously they're men made in the image of God, and they're dealing with the Creator, and they have the same reason in human nature we do, right?
Sure.
We can't
Yeah,
atomize that in some kind of historicism way. But at the same time, their contemplation, reflection on nature and human nature is nascent. And so you have to be careful, like what's a realistic expectation to see here? But I still think, like, if you look at the text overall, you see people being sorry that they have committed something. So I don't think...
Yeah, I mean, you see retributive justice happening all the time, right? This is why we're giving like big sacrifices of different things, like to try to gain favor. Like, oh, we're sorry for what we've done, and thus we're sacrificing whatever it is.
Right. So my point there is, like, one, it is in Greek culture. So what my point there is saying is that I don't think we can say that this is an anachronistic read or expectation. The more narrow question, which I think is yours, is like, okay, well, does Odysseus, why am I doing that? Does Achilles, as a demigod, and a demigod that's really coupled to rage, maybe to the same way that like Hercules is coupled to strength, right? Does he have the actual capacity to give like a metanoia? I don't know. I think this is this is the only closest that we get, right? Because even the gods don't. I'm trying to think if there's a example of a god doing that in the Greek mindset that seems very alien to the immortal life.
Yeah.
Right. But no. So I think that it still all kind of settles into the fact, because I think too, like, even if he doesn't have the capacity, I think the problem is that then I have no idea how you read him as like the noble hero who has like a rebirth scene at the end of the Iliad.
Oh, I'm not taking that stance. Like that's not the camp that I fall in, even like as my first time read. That he's he is like this noble redemption scene. Although I do have, I just thought that, like, I'm not sure if he has that capacity to actually be completely 100% repentant.
Yeah, that's a good question. He also gives, like, at 6:15 or so.
6:15. Okay.
We've been tracking this theme of fate, and Achilles gives like his own little comment here, basically, right? He says, "So the immortals spun our lives that we wretched men live on and bear such torments. The gods live free of sorrows."
Oh, there we go.
There are two great jars. Now, what that actually means is a little different, because like we have clearly seen like Aphrodite go through sorrow. We have clearly seen Ares go through, right? Like, he gets injured and is hurt and goes up and rages at, Zeus for like how he's being treated, and actually somewhat whiny.
Right.
So we really have to maybe do some grammatical work on what that actually means, because they do definitely suffer harm and missed expectations that make them upset.
Yeah.
Right. But there are two great jars that stand on the floor of Zeus's halls and hold his gifts. Our miseries one, the blessings, the other blessings. So I just point this out because we've been tracking this concept of fate. And so here, man, I need a coffee or something. Or I'm just going to walk off and you can finish the podcast. Achilles, right? Gives this commentary on how he sees this work. And then I think it's really interesting because in a certain way, he kind of pivots back into his father around 630, and he kind of presents himself as a curse, right?
Doomed at birth.
Because his father basically gave him an immortal goddess for the wife. That's a blessing. But then they piled on the hardships, right? He doesn't have a powerful race of princes. He has one son, doomed at birth. So it's interesting that Achilles somewhat pivots here in the self-reflection that he is a curse to his father, or he definitely is not coming from the jar of blessings, right? So Priam, 650, he asked for him to get, hey, can you give, okay, this is a great speech. Can we have Hector's body? Achilles responds, and this is where I talked about earlier, right? Don't tempt my wrath, right? He actually ends that dialogue around 669.
I find this very interesting because it's like this contention, again, this internal struggle between, as a demigod, of a human and godlike figure. Like he realizes, like at this point, like, listen, I'm at this human point. Do not bring me back to this godlike wrath.
Right.
This do not tempt my wrath, because I also can't contain that either.
Right. Particularly a rage, right?
Right.
But what's really notable too is it's not just simply like a rage. I mean, the level of depravity he's actually warning him about. So if you look at the end of that little passage, don't anger me now, don't stir my raging heart still more, or under my own roof I may not spare your life, old man, suppliant that you are, may break the laws of Zeus. So not only might he just kill him, right, in his own rage, but he is a guest. Right, Achilles is his host, so he should be protected by the laws of Zeus, right, under the concept of guest friendship that we've talked about. And so for him to threaten, right, and I can hear someone saying this is just idle talk, whatever. Achilles is trying to save face because he just cried in front of him. I'm not sure I would go down that path, right? I think his anger is still very much there and raging. And the fact that he even threatens that, like, I will literally go against the laws of Zeus and slaughter you where you stand.
Those don't seem like empty words.
No, I don't think they are too. So they make it this really, they bathe the body, they clean it. I think it's notable.
By the way, just by the way Priam responds to that, I think also kind of solidifies that those weren't empty words, because the old man was terrified.
Right.
Like if someone's making a bluff and you call their bluff, you're not very scared.
And Achilles bounded out the doors like a lion.
So
it's a good observation. So the body is bathed, it's anointed, and then I think quite notably, that Achilles lifted up Hector into his own arms and laid him down. Right. It's interesting that he somewhat apologizes to Patroclus. Right. Feel no anger at me, Patroclus. Right. As he's actually doing this. So, and again, I don't think Patroclus is the one who would care. Right. Patroclus's whole job actually was to temper the rage of Achilles. So then we get this really interesting passage around 700. Now, we're talking about that this redemption scene, he is descending back into his humanity. And I think we're going to see a couple more observations that lend to this read. One is the guy hasn't eaten. So not only does he eat with Priam, he's the one that convinces Priam to eat, saying that his emotions can't last out forever. And he gives this little myth about Niobe to say basically like, listen, you, despite your grief, you need to eat. It's a really interesting turn of roles. Everyone has been telling Achilles to eat the last couple books, and he won't do it. Right. And then he gets here with Priam. He's
like, you need to eat.
And he's like, by the way, you need to eat. Right? And so they set out bread and they eat together.
Yeah.
And it's really 740. Priam right, gazed at Achilles, marveling now at the man's beauty, his magnificent build. Face to face, he seemed like a deathless god. And Achilles marveled at Priam, beholding his noble looks, listening to his words. So they're sitting there eating, right, and there's just like mutual respect between them. Let's see, Priam's going to go sleep on the porch. But the other thing that I want to point out is, we should mention, before I get to the sleeping arrangements of Achilles, is that Achilles also allows Priam to have a certain time period to bury Hector. Mm-hmm. And so we talked about this like in the opening narrative. So they settle on the fact that on the 12th day we will fight again. Right? So they have 11 days. On the 12th day we'll fight. I just noted like, one, can we just keep in mind Achilles has no authority to do what he's doing?
Right.
And so I think it's really interesting that it bookends that there's about to be another conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon. And you know that Agamemnon's not going to take this well because Hermes wakes up Priam and says, why are you, like, Priam has become comfortable in the care of Achilles. Mm-hmm. And Hermes wakes him up and is like, if Agamemnon finds you here, how do you think that's going to go over?
Yeah, you're dead.
Right? So then you have to ask yourself, what's Agamemnon going to feel like when he finds out that they gave them, 11 days of peace?
Right.
And that Priam was in the camp.
Right. It's a slap in the face.
Yeah, so it's funny to me, like, is this going to come full circle back? Is this kind of
We're starting all over again.
In a lot of ways, yeah.
Remember last week when we were talking about the circle of life?
Yeah, where you're going to play that? Yeah, very good.
Now's the time to play it.
So I do want to note that at 790, the sleeping arrangements, Priam goes out on the porch, but Achilles goes back into his lodge in his bed and sleeps with Briseis in all her beauty, sleeping by his side. It's not entirely clear to me that it's sexual. I'm not sure that's
oh, come on.
a necessity. Well, my point here is that...
You don't think so?
Well, I think if I was going to argue that it was, I don't think it's on its face. But how did we just skip over that? How did we skip over Thetis's... where's the guide? Remember, Thetis comes to... Yeah. We kind of skipped over it. When Thetis goes to her son to tell him, like, hey, this is what Zeus has declared, right? This is his mom.
Right.
On 155 or so, she says, my child, how long will you eat your heart out here in tears and torment? I'll wipe from your mind all thought of food and bed. So keep it that mind, right? Mm-hmm. Food and bed. Mm-hmm. It's all a welcome thing to make love with a woman. You don't have long to live now. Well, I know.
Right.
Right? So she encourages him, right?
Listen.
Food and bed.
Yeah.
Right? And so this is part, I think, of his descent back into humanity, right? He's eating. He convinces Priam to eat. He eats with Priam. And now he's sleeping back in the lodge.
His concupiscible appetites are firing all cylinders.
Right. He's not sleeping out. Because just even sleeping in his lodge is a move back towards humanity, right? Mm-hmm. This guy's been sleeping out on the shoreline and passing out. He hasn't been going to bed. He's been passing out.
Right, from exhaustion.
And so now to come back to sleep in his bed and to be back with the comfort of a woman, right?
Where is that? Is it 8?
What are you talking about?
Like where it talks about him going
Briseis?
back? Yeah.
790.
790,
right?
Yeah.
A deep in his sturdy, well-built lodge, Achilles slept with Briseis in all her beauty sleeping by his side. This is very much like a bookend, right? Like think about how it starts.
Yeah.
Right? With the conflict with Briseis and his rage. And like as you mentioned earlier, like his rage is placated. Mm-hmm. And now he is back eating. He's back with a woman.
Yeah,
right?
it's more humanized. So you don't think, though, that this is a sexual nature?
I don't think the 791 that we just read is clear. Like deep in his study, you tell me, and deep in his sturdy, well-built lodge, Achilles slept with Briseis in all her beauty sleeping by his side. I do think, though, that if you read it with him following his mother's advice, then yes. I don't have a hill to die on here. I'm just like taking the text as it is.
Sure.
Right? But I think there's this, because remember, Briseis wasn't just a concubine.
Right.
Right? Briseis is who Patroclus wanted Achilles to marry, right? And it's unclear to us whether Achilles really knows this fact. It seems like he might, which is why Briseis was such a point of contention, right? Why not give up the slave girl? Well, it's not just about his honor. It's about that she represents to him another life that he chose against, right? A life that's about to end. So I actually loved it. The more, and I wrote about it in the guide, because the more I thought about the role of Briseis in this text, the more I just found it to be incredibly compelling and beautiful. So
My thoughts are he did.
yeah, that's fine.
Just be on record.
Yeah, and that would be keeping in parallel with his mother's comment.
Right.
And I don't know.
And Achilles very clearly has defers to the gods.
Right. It would be interesting. I don't know off the top of my head whether or not Briseis gives birth to a son, like whether or not there's a son here. Okay, so Hermes wakes up Priam. They go back. Cassandra in Troy sees them coming. Right, she calls out. All of Troy is plunged into uncontrollable grief. And so, they kind of go through Andromache, and she has, she gives her speech. Again, she's mainly worried about her child, right? So she says, this is like 865, and you, my child, will follow me to labor somewhere at harsh, degrading work. Right, because she's talking about Troy's going to fall. I will be sold into slavery. My child will follow me, slaving under some heartless master's eye. That, or some Achaean marauder will seize you by the arm and hurl you headlong down from the ramparts, a horrible death, enraged at you because Hector once cut down his brother, right? And so we'll get into what ends up happening to the son, but this is like, her response to this.
Crushed by Hector's hands.
Yeah. Hecuba also gives her little lament. Helen then gives a lament.
Yeah, where is that? I remember that.
That's 895 or so.
895. Yeah.
Helen has a weird statement here where she says, "How wish I had died before that day, but this now is the 20th year for me." So if you try and do the math on that,
she's like 40.
Well, it has not been 20 years since Paris brought her here. There's no way to make that timeline work.
Oh yeah, because we're not in the Odyssey yet.
Yeah, we're still in the Iliad.
Yeah.
And so it's like,
that's right.
Wait, what? And so,
what does Latimer say?
Fagel says that it's a hyperbole.
Okay.
Like, I've been here 100 years, right?
Okay,
it's a hyperbole because when I read that, I was like, wait, how does that even work?
Right.
Like she absconded or stolen, kidnapped, whatever way you want to look at it, with Paris. Yeah. And then they're in the 9th. So then they all got together. They're in the 9th year of being here.
Right.
Right. Like, how's that work? So they say it's a hyperbole. So King Priam, they keep their word. 9 days they hauled the store of timber, right, building the pyre, and then 9:25 or so.
Yeah,
right.
Homer really has to pick up the pace.
I know what happens.
Where's the horse?
Where's the Trojan? I remember reading it on this page the first time I read it. I wasn't even absorbing it. I was just like getting it to the bottom. I was like, because this is it. This is the end. Yeah. This is where it just cuts off. So 9:25, they placed his corpse aloft the pyre's crest and flung a torch and set it all aflame. And there goes Hector. Just a slight comparison. There's no mention of sacrifices here. Compare that to Patroclus' funeral, right? That had not only like men, but also stallions and hunting dogs and sheep and everything else. There's no mention of sacrifices here. They do collect his bones for an urn, and then they place those within a barrow, have a funeral feast, and the Iliad ends. And so the Trojans buried Hector, breaker of horses. What a wonderful, wonderful story. So, I mean, one of the immediate questions is, and particularly maybe as a first-time reader, and you kind of discussed this a little bit, but why do you think the Iliad ends with the death of Hector?
Well, I think because that's the end of actually. That's because I don't think the Iliad is about the story of Hector.
Okay.
And just because, like, I think the story is like as Homer says in the first few lines of book one, it's the rage of Achilles.
Yeah.
And so I think like because the rage of Achilles has now like actually been like ceased, like he knows. The biggest shock to me was like because I had heard from other people like there's no horse in the Iliad, like even though like that was frustrating for me, knowing like that is spoiler alert.
Right.
But the biggest frustration for me was like actually I don't know how Achilles died.
Oh yeah.
Because like we are now on the bell curve of the lowest part of the bell curve of Achilles. The story is about Achilles. The story is about the rage of Achilles. And he has hit this pinnacle. He has come down from the pinnacle. We've seen him more in the humane side. We've seen like him cross off all the boxes that he was supposed to do. He knew like he's the next batter up to be, to die. Mm-hmm. And then we don't see it.
Yeah, let's step back. I think the idea that like the Iliad ends because the rage of Achilles has subsided, I think is probably a very safe and typical read. Mm-hmm. I'd like to offer something slightly different.
Yeah, do it because again, first time reader.
Well, I don't think it has to do with first time reader. I think that's a good take. I think it's a very good take. Thanks. We're having a beer because we finished the Iliad.
This is like infest. Like
yeah, it's very festive.
Very festive.
We should have a funeral game. I'm not really sure how many of those I could win.
Let's box on camera.
Right.
Donate to Patreon.com.
All right. So it's okay. I think there's like punishments in arcane law for hitting clerics. I'm gonna hide behind that.
Yeah, I think I would actually be excommunicated.
So let me offer this up.
Okay.
I think everything you said is good, and I think it's a good take. I think it's probably a safe take. And by safe, I just mean it's probably more safely connected to the text.
Right.
I tend to lean more into seeing Homer as a teacher and more of that Homer uses irony. And I think that's a huge debate. I just want to point that out.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That it's a huge debate whether Homer uses irony. And what I mean by irony here is that there's basically, I don't want to say there's two ways, but maybe there's two bookends on the spectrum. Okay, so one is that Homer is simply a flat reflection of his time. Okay, he's not trying to teach anyone anything.
He's just telling the story.
He's just telling a story, right? And so you can't read into Homer any kind of like pedagogical purpose into the Iliad. Okay, he's just a bard. He's just telling a story. Now, is he, a master craft at it? Yes. Like, did he collect all these narratives and weave them together in a wonderful way? Yes. But he's not a teacher. Now the culture and the story might be a teacher incidentally, just
right.
because you're learning from the culture, but he himself is just a reflection.
Or he is a good teacher at describing how people die.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, remember that guy that got fish hooked out of that chariot?
Golly,
that was a good one. We should talk about like our favorite deaths in the Iliad. So what I would propose is that I think, and we've talked about this a little bit, is that I would give that Homer is trying to teach us about what virtue is, or arete, right, in the Greek. This is a very beginning conversation about what it means to be an excellent human. And I think where I would really push into this and say, what do we think he's doing is the role of Hector against his Greek aristocratic audience. So his Greek audience is very much going to lend into Achilles, right? He's
naturally.
the hero,
yeah,
right? And even to a certain degree, Odysseus. And we'll get into that, who I think plays a much larger role kind of once the Iliad subsides.
Once all the action's done.
So, however, I think that Hector is offered as a foil to Achilles. Okay. I think that this foreign prince, this Trojan prince, is very clearly compared to Achilles throughout the text, right? So Achilles is raging. He's focused on himself. He's willing to allow his countrymen to be slaughtered to, placate his own, pride. Whereas then we're getting these like somewhat just like over the top narratives of Hector is chosen to go give the sacrifice to the gods or to tell Hecuba, what to do, and then he gets to visit his family. And that whole book, right, was very much like a monument to Hector's piety, right? Achilles,
sure.
So I think that what my thesis here would be is that I think Homer offers these two characters in contrast. And I think there's a pedagogical purpose to that contrast. I don't think it's just a flat reflection of like Troy happened to have this guy who cared about the gods, the city, and his family, and we happen to have this raging demigod, and that's it, right? I think Hector offers these two in a pedagogical purpose of asking the question, what does it actually mean to be an excellent man, right? Arete, its etymology is a little obscure. It could be related to Ares, right? Right? Mm-hmm. And we see this, that the original excellence of man is almost one for one on the excellence of war, right? So how are you an excellent man? Well, you have military prowess. You're a good warrior. In this case, Achilles is the most...
You fight at night.
Right? Achilles is the most virtuous, excellent man in the Iliad because he's the best at war. And I think that Hector is offered here as a contrast to say, I think the excellence of man is a larger scope. The excellence of man includes a piety towards the gods. It includes a fidelity and a care for the polis. It includes, dare I say, a love and support of your family, both, and not just your nuclear family, but also like your parents, right? There's all these little lessons that I think are offered throughout the Iliad. And I actually think that one of the like kind of stark lessons in this is the fact that once Hector's dead, there's no contrast to be made anymore, and the story ends. Because I would actually push into that the reason we keep getting all these little statements in book 24 that Achilles might just kill you in the house, or Priam's like, hurry up, like his anger's raging, is to show us that that rage is actually not gone. It's placated to a certain degree, but it's not gone. The rage of Achilles endures.
But don't you think it's just because of his nature?
Well, sure, but the question is the rage of Achilles over? And the answer to that is no. But the Iliad is over. And so I would actually hinge the end of the Iliad more on...
that would like defeat my whole premise.
But does that make sense? Like I would actually hinge the end of the Iliad based upon the fact that it's Hector dying that ends the primary pedagogical purpose of the Iliad, which I'll fully acknowledge is a very robust, thick understanding of like Homer as teacher. But maybe to jump ahead a little bit, not too much, but I just want to maybe kind of link or anchor this theory to a little bit more of the text.
Okay. Is
in the Odyssey. Okay? Because the question would be like, okay, well, if Homer's really challenging his Greek audience on what arete is, do we see him do that somewhere else? Right? So in the Odyssey, in the Iliad, the theory is there's a contrast going on between Hector and Achilles. In the Odyssey is the first time, to my knowledge, and what I've seen everywhere, it's the first time we ever see arete used for a woman. It's completely used out of military context. Penelope, Odysseus' wife, who is cunning and is very faithful to her husband, is referred to as having arete, as being virtuous or excellence. And it's in that, to call a woman that completely blows up that ancient understanding. And if you keep going down the conversation of great books even more, when you get to, say, Plato, in the opening of Plato's Republic, he's talking about the arete of a knife, the arete of a horse, the arete of a slave, the arete of the warrior, right? He's saying that,
the teleology?
Yeah, everything has an excellence.
Right.
What does it mean to be an excellent knife? Well, the purpose of a knife is to cut. So what is an excellent knife? It's sharp. The virtue of the knife is to be sharp. Right. What's the vice of a knife? What would be right to not be excellent? It would be dull. Well, why? Because it would be contrary to its purpose. So by the time you get to Plato, like you're getting this very robust understanding that excellence applies according to the nature of the thing.
Yeah.
And I think that in the Iliad, Homer offers us a contrast between Achilles and Hector to ask us what is the nature of man, which then lends to the question, then we must know if we know the nature, then we know what it means to be excellent at it. Right. And I think that one of the giant flags that he's playing around and doing something is in the Odyssey when he uses that word to refer to a woman.
Okay.
That's okay. Well, I have not convinced Adam Minihan.
No, like I want to like. There's a couple questions that I have, but I'm afraid that this is a poor take. But I don't mind. I'll do it anyway. So if we understand like the whole purpose of this is is like understanding what the end of man is, like what is virtue, like what is arete, like how do we
in a very beginning
stages,
like a very beginning stage.
the very elementary
Right.
kiddie pool swimming in the kiddie pool stages. Do we know what the end of the gods are?
Well, I think so.
Hold on, let me.
go ahead.
Like that's kind of a rhetorical question because like whatever you say, like the end of the gods are, because we know it's not virtue. It's not. It can't be because
Right.
like they're not. There's
Well, also because think about Achilles' deification arc.
Right.
It's not an arc towards excellence.
Towards excellence
it's an
or virtue.
arc towards that godlike rage.
right. So like whatever that end is,
Right.
then you see the demigod of Achilles, which how do you marry the two of like, okay, here's a demigod who is trying to fight this internal struggle, which we really see at the very end of the last couple books of the Iliad, of Achilles trying to become more human, yet like does he have this tension of not being able to become human because he's also a demigod? Because we don't know actually what the demigod's end is. If we are trying to understand what the end of humanity is, like what is the capacity in which Achilles could actually be a hero?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like
Yeah, it does. I just don't think it's Homer's point. So I don't think that Achilles has that level of character development, and I don't think he can ever escape his rage. Like so
he's too flat of a character.
I'm not sure if he's a flat of a character. I just think of the nature of who he is as a demigod, and a demigod that's tethered to his rage. I don't think Homer has a purpose in giving Achilles some type of character development that leads him into virtue. I don't think that's his purpose in the text. I think Achilles and Hector serve as contrasts to get the audience to ask, what does it mean to be an excellent man? I don't think that Homer presents a path in which Achilles becomes that. Now, some people have said that scene with Priam is that scene, but I don't think that. I think that's.
Well, you also like that's hard to reconcile him also saying like "shut up, old man" or like
Right.
my wrath.
I think those are very, very intentional statements.
So that to me that means that like Achilles is an extremely tortured soul.
Well, I think because even like earlier you mentioned like he's trying, like you used a phrase, and I apologize because I'll probably butcher it, but you said something like he's trying to recapture his humanity. And I would really have to think about that, about whether or not I think he has any intentionality on doing that. Because I think he's just along the ride for his rage in Thetis and Zeus.
But
and
he's weeping.
Yeah, but he didn't orchestrate that. Like he's having an emotional reaction, but he's not like on a journey to recover his humanity. Right? He's not like intentionally going out to seek it. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, but
because he would then have to have the self-awareness to realize that he needs to recover that. And I don't.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I don't think he has that. I think that because of Thetis and Zeus orchestrating this thing with Priam, right? It's Zeus's intention, right? I will give him gifts to melt his rage. It's not Achilles saying, I need to melt my rage. That's a statement we'll never hear come out of Achilles' mouth.
Sure.
So that's my only purpose there, is that I think that I don't think Achilles is offered the depth of character to have some type of self-reflection like that. I just don't think it's present.
Man.
So I think that one thing I should mention is that before we even started the podcast and before I wrote, what did this end up being? This like
115 question guide.
Like 115 page. It's 60 something pages.
I'm going to really push him into trying to get this published.
So before I ever wrote this, I wrote a little article on Hector, and we can end with this.
No. We can't end with this.
We can't?
No. We cannot end with this because, like, I want to know what happens to Great Ajax. I want to know what, like.
Well, maybe we'll think about it. Is that Hector sorry. Okay. So I wrote the short little article for the Alcuin Institute on Hector as the first of the 9 worthies.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the questions we can ask here, who cares about Deacon Garlick's opinion, right? Like, is it tethered to anything?
Bro,
So
I care.
If we look about it, so we're in this like great books tradition, and we're starting with the Iliad and moving forward. Well, we could cheat a little bit and look at the tradition and look back at the Iliad. And so one of the ways to do that is the medievals had, maybe I might call it a devotion, right? It was a pedagogical tool, for knights and things like this and chivalry, is what was called the 9 worthies, okay? And these were 3 pagans, 3 Jews, and 3 Christians, 3 Catholics, that emulated, right, this kind of like masculine virtue, right?
Okay.
This magnanimity, this being spirited, chivalry, etc. And my point here is that the first of the 9 worthies, who is the virtuous character, is Hector. So the first of the 9 worthies of where does like the story of virtue start is Hector. And so I wrote a little article basically giving this Thetis. Oh, we do need to quit. Thesis. Yeah, I did not give a sea nymph. Where
way cooler if you did.
Right. Where basically I make the same argument that if you look at Homer as teacher and what he's doing this, and this is how our tradition, particularly the Catholic tradition, took it, that Hector was offered as the actually truly virtuous character,
right,
and that he begins the virtue tradition on the Greek side. Now, clearly, on the Hebrew side, I don't remember all the characters. I think it was David and Joshua. I think it's David, Joshua, and then Judas Maccabeus are the 3 Old Testament ones, right? And these are this convergence of them into Catholicism. But there's this wonderful devotion of the 9 worthies. Google it, look it up. My article might pop up where I kind of make this argument. And I think as we look at Hector and we look at the end of the Iliad, I think we can make a defense that Homer is trying to get us to ask what is virtue, and being a self-centered, raging, atomized individual is not the actual answer. The guy who dies for the gods, who dies for the polis, who dies for his family, right, and cares for them deeply, that is actually where human excellence lies.
I get, like, there's no way I'm going to disagree with any of that, because that would be wrong.
I don't think you'd be wrong to disagree. I just think
I'm not going to disagree with like where virtue lies is like, putting yourself like
right,
self-sacrificial and things like that. Like, of course that's the case. So I'll give just like a brief, like, here's what my final thoughts are on reading the Iliad for the very first time, right? So there are some peaks and valleys in reading the Iliad.
Yeah.
Like, I think that if you're reading it for the first time, so I am not educated in the great books. I'm not educated in, I'm not a theology major, a philosophy major of any sort, and try not to pretend to be one in any capacity. So, like, reading this was a, somewhat of a struggle for me at times, because it just felt like it was dragging at times. My attention span is very low as a modern man who shuffles through Twitter at times and like is getting dopamine hits left and right. And so the perseverance that it takes to read through it, like, for me was something that I was glad that I did. Like, and I think that it was also being able to do that through reading it with other people, right? And walking through it together. I'm not positive I would have finished it, to be honest with you, without a group, right? Because I think I would have died like in book 14, 15, or 16, like where it was just like, I'm not sure where we're going with this.
Right.
And I was taking flat reads and things like that. So the guide was instrumental in like being able to pull out, like, understanding like what, not only what we're reading like on face value, but also like what other people have commented on, and like what the tradition of reading the Iliad that I probably would not have picked up on as a first read. I think was instrumental. Reading it together as a group was extremely valuable. I really liked certain parts. I really disliked the parts that I disliked, I think, the most. like just to give raw. Here's what I disliked the most. Were some of the battle scenes, like were some of like how I expected certain warriors to act and they didn't act.
Yeah, his missed expectations.
Yeah. So that was probably like my biggest like, oh, are you kidding me? And also my biggest hatred is the gods interfering during times when it's like you don't need to be interfering.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So like that to me was like very frustrating as a first time reader, because I also didn't understand what the end of the book was going to be about. So those were a couple like hot takes as a first time read. What I really enjoyed though was following the narrative of obviously Hector, following the narrative of great Ajax. Like I really liked great Ajax a lot as a natural warrior.
Right.
I liked Diomedes, but like Diomedes like was like really prevalent in like 5 books or whatever it was, and then like he kind of fell off, and then you don't see him again for a while. Like I thought he was a great warrior, but didn't see a whole lot of him. Like the character development was a little lower.
Mm-hmm.
Odysseus didn't make as big of a splash in a lot of times that I thought he was going to.
Right.
But we'll get a chance to see that in the next 6 months, which will be great. The relationship between Patroclus and Achilles was interesting. The way that the gods interfered and didn't interfere, like I liked Athena for a lot of the book. The ending kind of like gave me a little sour taste of what Athena was like.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that Zeus is very fickle. Like,
right.
I don't have a lot of respect for his Zeus, so to speak. Kind of like a meathead, like is how I view him. Like a lot of times, although at the very end, like he made him kind of like when we understood like how the breakdown of like why Athena and Hera hated Troy, like we started realizing, oh well, he actually did have a little bit of a mastermind behind like how he played this out. Mm-hmm. I thought that was entertaining.
Yeah, he's very much always presented. I mean, it's funny. Sometimes he is completely dominated by his baser passions.
Right.
Right. And then sometimes like he is this ridiculous mastermind.
Right.
Which is sometimes why you can't, talking about themes in the book, sometimes it's very difficult to try and extricate Zeus from like fate in general. Yeah. And now that we're done with the book, I think that's like one of the themes that as I read it this time, I really tried to work through was like, what is the relationship between, Zeus and that nameless fate? Mm-hmm. And I think I agree with Fagles. Latimer holds like it's just an alter ego. I think I like Fagles where it's like, no, they seem distinct, but trying to actually like have any kind of clear division between them by the end of Iliad is not present. Mm-hmm. So it just becomes a perennial question, right? What is the relationship between the divine and fate, right? What are those related to? And then that trickles down to clearly what's the relationship between fate/gods and human agency, my free will. Right. And I think the Iliad it's really hard to read a lot of human agency into the Iliad. Like you say, like, well, what was Hector's culpability for some of his things? Or sometimes let's let the poor guy die. I mean, how many times does he like resurrected?
Give the man a break.
Like, how many times does he do this? And like, Zeus is like, oh yeah, go ask Paris to judge this thing. Like there's, or Athena is like clouding everyone's judgment. So really, I think a standard read of the Iliad is that it's incredibly fatalistic. Man does not have a lot of human agency and freedom, and his ambit is basically to be a puppet of the gods. And the reason I kind of harp on that is because as we move into the Odyssey is written later. We'll still hold that it's written by Homer, but a lot of people will say it's a much more mature text for multiple reasons. But one of those reasons is because it seems very clearly that Odysseus's choices have true effects in reality, meaning that human agency is something that's much more prevalent than, say, like in the Iliad.
Yeah. One of the things, and the last thing I'll say is that what I really enjoyed, because I've already read some of Dante, I've already read some of Plato, being able to have the context of what they're talking about after reading the Iliad, like really makes me excited about going back and like starting to read Plato again and reading Dante again. And so this is the beauty of the great books, right? This is what we've been like the whole purpose of we started with sin and things like that is like this whole joining in the conversation of these great authors talking about all these great stories, all these great things, right? Is that being able to say like, oh, well, Plato is referencing Homer, Dante is referencing Aristotle and Plato and Homer, and then there's Boethius, and like you start realizing like, oh, well, there's all these like context, like they're building upon each other, and so as a guy who has not read this, like, read the great books before, but reading some pieces and things like that, it's provided so much more context and richness and enjoyment in reading this, and I'm really excited about reading the Odyssey and then getting into Plato.
Yeah, so let's talk about a little bit about where we're going, right? So we have our year of Homer.
Yeah.
I think next we're going to do a little interim episode because the Odyssey does not pick up right where the Iliad leaves off. Okay. Right? So there's probably a lot of questions about like, wait, what happens to Achilles? What happens to great Ajax? What happens to Diomedes or Nestor? Like, what happens to these characters?
Yeah.
Does
Nestor stay? Like, right. Is he?
Nestor is elected king of the
ruins. I will end this podcast if Nestor is like, if we find out that Nestor dies from like choking on a ham bone or something.
He like trips coming out of his tent.
Right.
It breaks his hip. So, some of them will leave for the Odyssey because the Odyssey picks them up, and some of them we just don't know about. So there's some context. So I think we'll have a little interim episode to help with that transition.
Okay.
Then, like, we're really excited because we actually are going to have Dr. Patrick Deneen, right?
That's right.
On the podcast, along with Dr. Chad Pecknold, and they're going to help us kick off the Odyssey. Why do we read this, et cetera? I think I do have it.
Yeah.
So Dr. Deneen actually wrote The Odyssey of Political Theory, which is a wonderful text that actually takes the Odyssey and uses it as an analogy for understanding politics. And so he knows this text incredibly well. So we'll kind of ask him, like, why should we read it? What should we expect? You know, just some like basic introductory questions and really kind of learn, I think, from a true intellect on why we should actually read this text. And then we'll jump into it and have 6 months on the Odyssey.
We also interview Jason Craig from Sword and Spade on the Odyssey, which he gives a great context of like father and son, you know, relationships and the importance of father-son. He wrote a beautiful article on Our Sunday Visitor about the importance of reading the Odyssey as a man, and it was interesting, I think, to be able to get his take as well.
Yeah, no, very good. I think that's one thing we're going to do as we kind of move into the Odyssey is start having a lot of these guests on that kind of help us navigate like one book or the other.
Yeah. Deacon, I'm incredibly grateful for your work on the guide and working through this with me and your patience. Golly, I cannot, like, if anything, okay. This has just been an act of charity towards you. For you to work through this with me and your patience and willingness to work through this. But I thoroughly enjoyed it.
No, it's very good. I appreciate Homer's a teacher, right? We're the students and we're working through it. So until next time.
We'll see you next week.